So looking at the Bible, plain meaning, obscure meaning. Is it very obvious what you can do? Is it not obvious? And what does God want for us as we engage with the Bible? And let's start with the first, the plain meaning. And I suppose in this I might be drawing on the great 16th century reformers. And in this, they were living, they might have grown up in a world where the Bible was not, it was in Latin, not even in the native language, English. It was in Latin, so inherently it was only readable by an educated elite. And potentially behind that there were some power games, If only the educated elite or the priestly caste can read it, then they kind of withhold the power of the word of God from the common man. And in fact, the argument might go, of course, you just have to translate it into English, and that will set the common man free to understand it for themselves, and the plain text will be clear. And I think that obviously it was vital to get it translated into English. I think there can be a mistaken extension to then think, once it's in English, the meaning will be clear. Because I think a lot of these meanings aren't entirely clear. And so there's something in the plain sense, but I think it's a very limited and problematic model. And I suppose what's the opposite of plain? You might say obscure. And if you want someone who kind of delights in the obscurity, you might head to someone like Augustine. And Augustine's a 4th century theologian, so he knows nothing of all the 19th century evolution debates and all that kind of stuff. So he's not affected by that. But when you read what he thinks about the Bible, he says, well, of course you can't be taking it just literally, or you could if you're very childish, he says. But if you think about it seriously, it can't be just literally taken. So he just goes to the first couple of verses in the Bible. When God created the heavens and the earth, and there's a formless void, and then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And Augustine comments, well, God can't be a sort of like a human-style person speaking, let there be light, because there's not much shape at the time. Time doesn't work like it would normally work for us. There's a formless void. How are these sound waves going to come out of this person's mouth? Clearly, it can't just mean God said in any kind of exact parallel with how human beings speak. It must have a deeper sense. And then he explores different ways in which there could be a deeper sense and how the formless void might be coming together. And he goes on and on and on. But his point really is that it is obscure. And the next point, though, which is counterintuitive, is that he likes the obscurity. Because for him, the obscurity means there's always something more to discover. So at one point, he compares it to people kind of going through a thicket of woods when they can't really see the whole woods, and occasionally just alighting upon some fruit that they want to eat, and they find the fruit very nourishing. And I think there's something in that as well. I suppose part of me is Protestant enough not to like willful obscurity. But I think where Augustine's kind of interpretation really scores is it's actually realistic. So to take an example which should be simple, I take something like the Ten Commandments, which should just tell you what to do. Thou shalt not kill, fine. Know what to do, won't kill anyone. But then what about when there's a war? And then the Bible's full of other things where there are wars, and there are full of times when even God encourages people, Israelites, to kill the Amalekites or whoever. And that's a questionable thing. And then there's Jesus' attitude to the Old Testament and the Old Commandments and what can be followed and what can't. But I think clearly there is a more subtle thing than just not killing. There's at least a very possible argument that there are circumstances in which killing might conceivably be appropriate and ethical. And it is slightly obscure. But you can't just read it off the Ten Commandments and go, oh, thou shalt not kill, oh, well, it's obvious. Because, that's a small part of the Bible, but it's surrounded by layers of complexity. And I think, whether you'd call it obscure or deep or rich or unfathomable, I think it is a more realistic approach to what we actually have. And I think it's a mistake to try and take the Bible as the menu or the instruction manual. And I suppose if I were looking for a metaphor, I wouldn't quite use Augustine's forest, but I'd stick with nature and say the Bible is the landscape in which we walk in our spiritual lives. For Christians, the Bible sets the landscape in which we walk. And you engage with it and wrestle with it. And, I read it every day, and it's a constant, I'd say, delight. I don't want to trivialize it. I think that has fundamentally enriched my life, and I wouldn't possibly want to stop doing that. But equally, I find it galling when I hear people take a chunk and then express something which seems to be quite a naive, plain sense interpretation, and it just doesn't kind of sit. It doesn't compute with me. So rather, I think the Bible is setting the landscape in which we make our life decisions. That's something which I think I can live with that and makes sense to me.